Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Friday Reads video for September 13th, 2019. It's been kind of a weird week for me, or a couple weeks really. I've been taking part in the DC Public Library's banned book scavenger hunt. They've hidden books around the city for the month of September, and I've found most of them. I have one left to go, and I'm single-minded in my pursuit. It's taking up a lot of time. So, I'm going to work and I'm searching for clues for this missing book. So my reading has been a little bit affected. I've relied a bit more on audiobooks so far than I usually do. But the first book I finished this week is Peony by Pearlesque Buck. Last we spoke, I was feeling a lot more courteous toward this book than I do now. And in fact, this is my first 2-star review in I think 2 years. I'm pretty rare to give negative reviews of books, and really by 2-star I probably mean 1 star. I really dislike where this book went. I think it was intellectually dishonest. Buck, who is who was the daughter of Christian missionaries, is basically using the template of exploring one of the final families of Jewish Kaifeng, a fictional family, but the Jews of Kaifeng had sort of assimilated and died out, but she's using it as a template for pro-assimilation by means of saying that Jews as a separate culture is a waste of time, and she does a lot of victim blaming in this book about, anti-Jewish violence, and about, how it has to do with Jews keeping themselves separate. As a Christian, she in no way probes the long history of anti-Jewish violence within Christianity, including, violence that forced people to stay separate. The Jews in her book read a lot like Southern Baptists to me. There's just a lot about this book I just found very dishonest, and I'm pretty proud of my Goodreads review, really. I went in, I did research, I read other reviews, I looked a little into her backstory, and so because it was such a negative review, I wanted to make sure I had some bolster behind me, because I don't want to rant without some, backing. But it's pretty rare for me. As I was reading this or slogging through it, I was thinking of Sean the Book Maniac and how I should, claim sanctuary in the empire of Baaldom, but, that's just not really my style, and especially since I hated it so much, I wanted just to make sure that I justified the hate by reading the whole thing. I don't know. I'm just glad I'm done. I'm glad I'm done. I think this is going to be the lowest point of the year, or at least I hope so. The next book I finished was one of the audiobooks, and I'm kind of sticking with a theme. I have a few themes, I guess, throughout this video, but the theme in this one would be religion. This one is The Raven Tower by Leckie. It is her first fantasy novel. Most people in the SFF community already know Leckie to have read her science fiction books, but I haven't read any of those yet. So weirdly, I've come to her through her fantasy first. This is a standalone fantasy and an epic fantasy, my favorite. It's a dual timeline story. There's a present-day timeline told in second person, where we're following the character of Aolo, who is sort of an advisor to the heir to a kingdom, or really the heir to a prophet. The prophet is someone who communes with the raven god, and also is sacrificed at the end of his life, or the god takes residence in actual ravens, and when the raven dies, then the lease has to sacrifice himself. So we're heading into this kingdom when the raven, the physical mortal raven, has died and hasn't been reborn yet, but the lease has disappeared, and his brother has taken over the bench quite suddenly, and it was supposed to be Aolo's friend Mowat, Really, I'm getting stuck in the weeds here. The story is sort of a mystery that unfurls basically about what happened, and of course there's some Hamlet overtones. The second part of the story is this sweeping past lifetime told by a god who resides within a rock or a boulder. And frankly, I'm kind of relieved that I remembered that detail from the podcast SFF Yeah, because the world building was kind of thick, I think, and I think I might have not picked up on everything if I didn't remember it from the podcast. But anyway, this is that storyline starts as sort of this huge rumination on time, because this being is ancient, you know, millions of years old, way before humanity, talking about geology and geography, and then ultimately into humans and the relationship between gods, and then what gives gods their power and what takes that power away, and then ultimately we step into the god who we could just shorten his name to Patience. He gets dragged literally into a war that is sort of precedes the kingdom stuff that's happening in the current day storyline by like several decades. And yes, they do, you know, meld together, and yes, Patience is the person or the god who is addressing Aeolo the you. So I have mixed feelings. I think a lot of people did, although I graded it very highly. I usually do that. I really did like a lot of it. I mean, I liked the whole idea that, you know, this is a fantasy, you know, she's laying her cards down on the table about fantasy world building, about supernatural power, about, you know, even putting all of, you know, usually so much fantasy deals with like human martial stuff, and that's more on the back burner, even though, you know, humans are fighting wars for gods and yada yada between cities and yada yada. But really, in the forefront of the forefront is all this supernatural, fantastical stuff, to the detriment of character development. None of the characters were really all that compelling on their own. And I even, you know, I usually am pro audiobook, and I was for this. I really liked the narrator, but I do feel like in this instance, I wonder if her rendition of Aeolo made me like him more than I might have if I just read it. And I think in a way it also has to do with the second person, which, you know, in most cases, including this one, I feel like is a cheat, because it sort of garners a sympathy for Aeolo that's more projection than character development. I mean, I feel like in a way I was manipulated more into liking Aeolo than maybe I should have. But at the end of the day, I really was impressed by all the world building, and the whole political plot also, you know, panned out nicely. So I enjoyed it. The next thing I decided to try on audio, though I also have a physical copy, is The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rossner, and I'm a little over halfway through this right now. This is a fairy tale retelling of sorts. Really, I believe it's a retelling of The Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, with a very Jewish tint to it, taking place in a shtetl town, I believe, at the turn of the 20th century. These two sisters live in a town, and they particularly live near the woods. It's a mixed town with Christians and Jews, where it seems like they're getting along until, you know, anything goes wrong and then the Jews are blamed. It's an interesting counterpart to Peony, and I guess this gets into another one of my big themes, which is of reading lately, which is anti-Semitism, and how this probes it a lot more honestly, I think, even while looking into this community, this Hasidic community, and questioning how closed-minded or separate they can make themselves to a certain degree, but not forgetting the fact that, you know, society at large holds them apart. You know, people can't travel on the roads without travel permits. The community turns against them whenever anything goes wrong in town. Anyway, but there's the fantastical element in this, is that these two sisters, Liba and Leah, actually are shapeshifters, and so are their parents. Liba and her father can turn into bears, and Leia and her mother can turn into swans. The girls are coming into that power and finding out about it, and meanwhile their parents kind of leave them and abandon them. Well, it's for a decent cause. The father's father is dying. But once they're abandoned, all of this crazy stuff starts to happen, including the Goblin Market parable about these boys who come into town selling fruit and enticing young girls away, including Leia, who is currently very much under their spell. And Liba also is under a different sort of spell where she's coming into her own power as a bear, but she's also feeling her own sort of love for or attraction for a boy in town. So there's a lot of sensuality, there's a lot of seduction, there's a lot of question of power even of these two characters, and also of manipulation, I suppose. I'm thinking a lot about the Goblin Market. I'm thinking of fairies, because every now and then we get a glimpse into, you know, the reality of the rot behind the facade. But it's romantically done. Anyway, I'm enjoying it. You know, it's atmospheric, it's enticing. I wish I had clout with Jen Campbell. I feel like this would be the type of story that she'd like. In fact, you know, there's backstories for how people have turned into bears and swans. The bear backstory has to do with anti-Semitism, in fact, that some Russian landlords forced their Jews to fight bears, and ultimately the Jews turned into bears. And then the swan backstory, I think, has to do with a fairy tale that Jen talked about once, or maybe in her collection, about the daughters of the Tsar turning into swans, I believe. I mean, this is all sort of backstory stuff, but it's, you know, inspiration for this, so I'd certainly be more curious to see about what someone with a fairy tale background would think of this. But coming from the Jewish perspective, there's an interesting threading in of these two cultures, the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish culture, and also that of just fairy tales of the region. So I guess I'm hoping for good things at the end of this book. I'm hoping that the girls can travail over their adversaries, but I'll check back and tell you what happens. I'm also in the middle, or really slightly past the middle, you know, I'm checking myself, in Atlas Alone by Emma Newman. This is the most recently published book of her Planetfall series. So this is about Dee. She's our main character in this book. She was secondary in after Atlas a couple books ago, and she's on a generation ship. There's a big mystery. I feel like I don't want to spoil a lot about the mystery and the parameters of it, because it goes into stuff that happened in After Atlas and is referenced in Before Mars, and a little bit in Planetfall, my favorite. But Newman is very interested in the future of humanity in these books. She's pretty cynical about it, and in this book in particular, we are on a generation ship that is manned by a Christian fundamentalist group. So I think, again, I guess I'm inching into a religious theme, and particularly that of violent Christianity in my reading. Yes, yeah, they are violent and responsible for a lot of violence in this book. Somewhat to the extent that, you know, when you lay it on this thick and they're the big bad guy, I do sometimes start to take a step back and think, you know, Emma, maybe you're being a little too harsh on religious folks, although I think, to be fair, she puts in a little bit of a caveat about how, you know, it's a specific subset that gains power. And also, I'm desperately looking forward to reading The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, speaking of speculative Christian fundamentalism, so apparently I'm on board. I think the real question for me is whether there's going to be any hope in the darkness at the end of this book. Tried to stay away from spoilers, although I think in terms of the BookTube SFF community, they have referenced what I've already seen of Newman's cynical nature. I have a threshold when it comes to cynicism. I'm relatively cynical myself, but I like the idea of hope in the darkness as well. So we'll have to see how this goes. And I'm also really interested to see how it particularly ties into Planetfall, which is the first book and sort of the least connected so far to the rest of them. So I don't know if she's going to be done after this or not. I'll probably have more of an idea at the end of this book, maybe. I guess we'll see. And finally, keeping on brand here, I think next on the docket I'm going to be reading Antisemitism Here and Now by Deborah E. Lipstadt. To, just put it out there bluntly, this is a nonfiction work about anti-Semitism. Deborah Lipstadt is a noted Holocaust historian, most well known, I think, for winning a libel suit against David Irving, who sued her for libel in the UK when she called him a Holocaust denier. But this goes beyond the Holocaust to talk about more modern day anti-Semitism. So it also was the book I held up at the very beginning of the year of 2019 published nonfiction that I want to read. So I'm also keeping in line with that I'm reading a lot of new releases lately. I'm also thinking of the Goodreads Choice Awards coming up and how much I want to be able to nominate for those categories. So hopefully this will fit the bill. So that about covers it for me now. In other news, I'm really behind on things. I'm behind on podcast listening. I'm behind on booktube watching, to the point where I wonder if I should just watch what's newest and figure that I will just never see some of the older stuff that I'm currently sequentially going through. I don't think that's the way most people even can do booktube if they have a lot of subscriptions, because there's just no way to keep up, especially if something takes you away from YouTube for a while, say a huge scavenger hunt. But since I've been watching videos so late, I haven't been interacting with people as much, and that's a big shame, and I'd like to do more of that, so I should probably do something about that and see what people are up to today, especially with all the Friday Reads videos coming out shortly. So I hope you all have good reading weekends. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.